Gremlins, Secrets of the Mogwai is now available on Amazon Prime for you to watch all 10 episodes, as well as on Max, the subsidiary of the Warner streaming service. And the producer of that series dropped by to talk about all of it. So, of course, you realize this means podcast.
Are you ready, eager young space cadet?
Meep, meep.
I saw a pussy cat.
Where's the kaboom? There was supposed to be an earth-shattering kaboom.
Hello, and welcome to, of course, you realize this means podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Graves, and with me today, it is a pleasure to introduce you to the mind, one of the minds behind Gremlins, Secret of the Mogwai, a prequel series behind one of the most classic 80s movies of our generation and so many others. Brendan Hay, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on.
It is an honor to chat with you and to discuss these little green creatures with you as we're going to dive into the origins and where Christopher Columbus might have come up with an idea like this.
Yeah.
Who knows?
I mean, yeah, nobody knows for certain, but I feel like there's definitely there's inklings of where these little fellas may have appeared before. And definitely things of where Joe Dante may have fallen in love with Gremlins before the films.
I love that. And Joe Dante, as you mentioned, that's the director of the first two Gremlins movies, Gremlins and Gremlins A New Batch. And speaking of new batches, we have the last batch of Looney Tunes cartoons, which we're going to talk about a short within that new series. But the last batch has dropped on Max, and I highly, highly encourage you to go watch it. Check it out. Wonderful art all across the board, fantastic animation, and it's a throwback series, so it pulls from the classics. Like it pulls from what we're going to be talking about, Bob Clampett shorts, and the Gremlin makes an appearance. We're going to get into that. And just so you know, if you're tiny or toony or just a little bit loony, we are going to talk about Tiny Toons. It is coming. And I cannot wait to have new guests and newfound appreciation for the classics, the Adventure series, and the Steven Spielberg presents the new series, the Looniversity series. So we're going to be discussing all the Tiny Toons. Get excited because that is coming. But now, let's dive into the Gremlins.
They become clever, mischievous.
What's going on here?
And dangerous.
Gremlins, huh? Little monsters. Right.
Gremlins, directed by Joe Dante.
So, Brendan, let's start with you. What is your first memory of the Gremlins? Like, where did you first come into contact with these little green creatures of mischief?
So yeah, it definitely was the 80s film version. That's where my first memory of Gremlins is that. And specifically, I had the classic kind of that age range, a book with a 45 record of telling you the story of Gremlins. So I had that, loved it, which is why then when like kind of late that summer into its release, I was spending a weekend at my older cousin's and they were going to see Gremlins. And it was, because I was younger than them. I was like 6 or 7 when it came out, and they were all like kind of early teens. But it was I know Gremlins. Yeah, no, I won't be scared. I'll be totally fine. And went along, and it was totally scared. It freaked me out to no end. It turns out the adaptation for little kids left out a lot of the gore and Santa Claus monologue and things like that. So,
wow.
I was not as
excited.
I totally was. I was nowhere near as prepared as I thought I was, but it was great because it was like, especially the thing I remember being really freaking me out was actually now something I absolutely love was the mom section, the section of like Billy's mom versus the Gremlins in the kitchen and the house and everything like that. And afterwards, so good. Oh my God. And by the way, how amazingly tough is she? Like every improvisation of you never look at a kitchen the same way as you see all these instruments of destruction.
Do you hear what I hear a song high above the tree with a voice.
But yeah, no, it freaked me out, but I loved it and couldn't stop thinking about it and wanting more and more Gremlins. So it was kind of my gateway to horror comedy, and something I still love dearly to today. We joked, Z, the showrunner and other executive producer, we constantly joked that everybody on our crew was somebody who watched Gremlins a little too young. And how, like, it's just this constant thing of, like, everybody was the, like, yeah, no, I watched it. It kind of messed me up, but I've also never stopped wanting to be a part of it. And that's kind of where we all came from. And it's funny because I remembered a few years after that, where I grew up, they had Merry Melodies every Sunday morning on Channel 9 on the East Coast there. So I'd always watch them. And that was at some point later seeing, was it The Falling Hare? Yeah. And that was just then putting even there a little bit of 2 and 2 together at probably only, like, 7 or 8 of, like, oh, okay, so this is a Gremlin too. So, like, Gremlins, I guess, exist in my mind. Is like maybe there's like years of Gremlins fiction out there, not realizing there's not a whole lot between Falling Hare and 1984's film, but, like, in my mind it was like, oh, okay, I wonder if these are connected. They kind of feel similar.
Right. So it's fascinating because Roald Dahl, the guy
Yeah.
who made the Chocolate Factory, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, he was working on this book called Gremlins, and Walt Disney wanted it. He wanted to adapt it. And he put out a mandate for other studios not to do anything with Gremlins. Well, everyone listened except for Warner Brothers. And
That sounds
Warner
about right.
Brothers put out The Falling Hare in 1943, directed by Bob Clampett. And, I guess let's get into it. So
Sure.
This is written by Warren Foster with incredible animation by Rob Scribner and a musical score that is unmatched by Carl Stalling. The way that the Gremlin just tricks and tricks and tricks Bugs Bunny. Like, Bugs Bunny had just come onto the scene in a big way 3 years prior. And already within the first 3 years, he's been put through the ringer. And this is one of those times where an antagonist, gets under his skin and he can't do anything about it. He's doing his utmost to remain cool, but it's really impossible when this Gremlin is wreaking havoc, throwing him onto a military air fighter and just kind of dive bombing without him having any control over the situation. So you said you grew up with this short. I grew up with this short. It meant a lot to me. And when I saw Joe Dante's The Gremlins, I also equated it to the Bugs Bunny short and being like, oh, maybe this is like somehow tangentially related, but obviously the coloring's different. And rewatching it, I noticed he has red gloves, but like blood red gloves.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that was intentional. Like he's known to get his hands really dirty.
Yeah, he's going to be caught red-handed doing everything. Because it is, there's two things. Like, one was, it blew me away because also I was just rewatching it before recording here. And I forgot. I'm like, this is the rare short, at least from my recollection, where it's like Bugs is totally outbugsed. That it is just like at no point does he really ever end up with an upper hand over this Gremlin. There's like the great gag that wraps it all up, but it's like, otherwise, if not for the comedy, Bugs totally is on the losing end of everything, which you never see. But the other thing is realizing all the connections of all the things kind of inspired. It's like this Gremlin, it's more of a low key energy, but he still has that like joyful chaos vibe that like the Joe Dante, Chris Columbus Gremlins have, where it is just like, it's not mean-spirited trickster. It is just a trickster that's just kind of like, it just lives and breathes chaos, as it has fun just living, it is going to ruin everyone around it. Like, its idea of life and fun is just misery and pain to everybody else. So I saw that inspiration. And then the other thing that popped in my head was actually, because for related, the other thing always when people think of Gremlins is like a gremlin on the wing. And I'm also now wondering, because I had forgot the shot where it is like the gremlin outside the plane window and Bugs looking at it. So then I also started thinking today, I'm like, wait a second, Rod Serling or whoever it was who wrote that episode of Twilight Zone, I'm like, wait, did he see this too? Because then I think it also triggered in my mind. I want to say there was a Tiny Toons that did Plucky with like a gremlin on the wing, and it was I want to say there was a gag in Tiny Toons. That one I haven't had a chance to go back and rewatch today, but like I kind of remember that. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So they did a series of Twilight Zone inspired shorts within its own like Night Ghoulery series, and that was one of them. But yes, Richard Matheson actually wrote a short story called Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, and then it was adapted into that Twilight Zone episode.
Sure.
Here, quickly! There's a man out there.
What?
Look, he's crawling on...
Nick Cravat played the gremlin, and William Shatner
Yes.
played the guy who sees something on the wing. And it is
Yes.
phenomenal. But yeah, like that also has to stem from this. Like there's no way it doesn't come from this.
It has to.
It is so methodically planned out, and the way that they incorporate a airplane with a creature of mass destruction, it just makes sense. It is terrifying in the Twilight Zone, but it's hysterical in the Bugs Bunny short.
Oh, so good.
I think it just blends both tones, as does your Gremlin series.
Oh, thank you.
It has a lot of horror elements. I would say it's gateway horror. For
That's our goal.
Kids
Yep.
and exactly for families, and it also has a lot of humor. So with both, I'm guessing you guys went back and like you looked at what came before, and I'm just gonna like break into the Gremlin series for a moment.
Yeah, please.
So you did the story of Sam Wing, who we see as the older gentleman who has the Mogwai, who he is afraid to sell to the father of the protagonist in Gremlins, and his story is yet to be told. And you take it back to whenever he was a kid. Was there any other time frame that you wanted to play with, or was it always let's develop Sam Wing more?
It was always that. It was, it goes back to Z-Chun, who I said he was the other executive producer and he was the showrunner. Him and Sam Register, who is the head of Warner Animation. Sam had just basically had a very quick conversation with Spielberg and Amblin about trying to do a Gremlins series. And Sam was the one who's like, rather than try to ever figure out what a sequel would be, because Joe Dante has, I think, accurately and famously kind of said that his goal with Gremlins 2 was to create a sequel-proof movie, because he didn't want to keep making them. So he's like, I want to just make it as wild and off the wall as possible. So rather than try to in any way one-up that, the idea was put out like, let's make a prequel. Let's do something that kind of goes back to how Gizmo and Mr. Wing originally met, and then Z landed on the take of like, let's go he's 10 years old in Shanghai, and kind of started crafting the story. And then myself and other folks, we all kind of came in early on and kind of just helped fleshing it out from there. And especially answering the questions of kind of where it all came from.
And Z-Chun is also known for his work on I Am Virgo and a myriad of other projects that you will know in the future. But his work in this is so great, and you guys like made a perfect pair for this, because I feel like you came at it from the right angle. Like this was the way to do it. It was to, bring that sense of adventure, sense of mystery into a modern era through animation. And I think it's gorgeous, and I love everything about it. So we're gonna get there, but let's go back to the Falling Hare real quick.
Sure. Yeah.
Hey, get a load of this, folks. It says here, a constant menace to pilots are the Gremlins who wreck planes with their Diabolical Sabotage. Gremlins. Oh, murder.
So it takes place in a U.S. Army airfield, and Bugs is sitting on a blockbuster missile, just hanging out, and as you do,
Everyone does.
reading a parody of Victory Through Air Power.
Yep. Love that.
by a book called Victory Through Hare Power. And he's quickly breaking the fourth wall, like letting us in on, like, he sees us. He wants to bring us in. He wants to tell us, like, his world and our world are somewhat connected, if you will. Again, I think that leads credence to the gremlin showing up in our world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has a lot to do with whenever Bugs breaks the fourth wall, like what possibilities in narrative that can bring about.
Mm-hmm.
So immediately he starts laughing and telling us gremlins are the weirdest, craziest thing you could ever come up with. And the fact that this book is talking about them is so weird. And I love the way that he reads Diabolical Sabotage.
Yeah.
Where he's like, Diabolical Sabotage, which is definitely the name of this episode. I'm not going to pass that up. And then the gremlin shows up, voiced by Bob Clampett, one of the only times Bob actually did a voice.
Yeah.
So it's Mel Blanc and Bob Clampett just kind of riffing with each other and making each other go insane.
Yeah.
Hey, could that have been a gremlin? It ain't Vendel Vilkey!
I love the little nuances. So when Bugs gets whopped upside the head with one of those heavy wrenches, he turns into one of those caricatures of a character who doesn't know where he's going, and he's like, which way did he go, George? Which way did he go? And the gremlin crosses his eyes and then points in both directions, and he goes, that way.
Yeah.
And then Bugs lands into the dirt with both teeth, just planting himself. And I love the fact that they went for it. Like, this is a cartoon that holds nothing back, and they put Bugs into a serious situation that no one would survive if that plane were to explode or like get to the surface level. And it's so funny that it runs out of gas and just like that's the gag. And it's an interesting parallel because the gremlin and Bugs are in on it for the audience's sake. And then if you go to High Speed Hare, the 2021 version, the gremlin is still going after Bugs and goes, I can get out and push. And he basically pushes the car to explosion.
Yeah. The homage and then one-upping of that ending in High Speed is so good. Because it's funny. It started to cross my mind. Because also the thing I love on both of them, they draw out the falling plane and falling Hare, and then the falling car in High Speed. It's drawn out so well. It's like building tension in a ridiculous way, like just Bugs facing death. Like, and again, the gag in High Speed, especially him carving his own tombstone while going down, is hilarious and cracks me up. So it's like, oh, it's this, and then as they're doing it in High Speed, I'm like, oh, I get the homage. You're kind of probably going to end it the same way, and sure enough, it does. With like, okay, out of gas, crisis averted. And then I can get out and push, and it's like it's a literally nuclear explosion that they take it to. In that case, I'm like, oh, well done. You took it. You gave me what I wanted, and then found something more.
Exactly, and that's what I admire about it. And the tombstone that he graves, it says, "That's all, folks."
Yeah,
and little reference there. And the joke is so well timed as well, because it is playing on the fact that electric cars have limited range. And I have a friend who has electric car, and he always has to like charge it before he leaves my place.
Yep.
And it's so weird that like that's a part of life.
Yeah, and it's equally like kind of like perfect for the time period, because I had to. It's funny, rewatching today, I had to look it up. I'm like, oh, I never really got that. The last line of the original is that thing about like, oh, this always happens with A cards. And I'm like, and now I realize that looking it up today, I'm like, oh, it was like gas rationing. It was like talking about like a very specific issue of the time during war. So I was like, oh, wow. I'm like, okay. And then their version was like, yeah, electric cars and like the specific problem that somebody driving that would face.
Right. Can you imagine somebody 50 years from now watching that short, the new one, and being like, what are they talking about? Limited range?
Yeah, and exactly. And as they look in their mind internet to be like, oh, apparently that was a problem back in. Yeah.
Speak to me, Mr. Bunny Rabbit. Why won't you speak to me?
I got some choice words for you.
Second thought. Save your breath.
Loss of navigational control. Steering wheel not found.
Exactly. So the Falling Hare is a fantastic short. If you haven't watched it in a while, it is on Max, and I highly recommend it. Actually, all of the shows and all the shorts we're talking about are on Max. Very convenient.
I was going to say, get your Max subscription and enjoy. Just hang out.
Exactly. So yeah, moving into High Speed Hare, I love how they did the title card. So Falling Hare has the action lines going down, and High Speed Hare has them going to the right direction, as if you're in a car speeding along the freeway, and immediately you're thrown into the situation where Bugs is like tired of walking and he needs a vehicle, and he finds this car lot that's apparently abandoned. Because he just like goes into this electric
you're
car,
right.
and it allows him to turn it on and just like take off. And he's enjoying the ride until he opens up the manual and it says electric cars attract gremlins. And he does the same thing. He starts laughing, breaking the fourth wall, going, "Oh my God, what's a gremlin? That's the most ridiculous thing." And then all of a sudden a gremlin is on his shoulder. And then brilliantly voiced by Bob Bergen, by the way, who is known for voicing Porky Pig in this series. And I think he does a really good job of also bringing the gremlin to life here as well.
Yeah.
And he immediately goes for the computer. He's got to eat the main control computer, the touchscreen computer for the car. And then the steering wheel breaks off. He presses all the buttons and everything, and just utter mayhem. The fact that you have the Mogwai and these creatures that stem from him, while allowing Gizmo to remain cute and remain innocent. I love that touch. And I know that was changed from one of the first drafts to what we got in the cinema. Can you speak to that a little bit?
A little bit, just because I've always been curious. I had heard that kind of, again, like anecdotally, like we all had, and gotten to speak to Joe Dante about that. And apparently the change came really late in the game. Like they were, I want to say like just like 6 weeks out from starting to shoot. And they were showing off the Gizmo puppet. And again, at that point, the plan had still been, okay, he's, cute, adorable, furry Mogwai for the first 20 minutes. He eats after midnight with the rest of them, and he actually turns into Stripe, and is Stripe the rest of the movie trying to kill everybody.
Wow.
And Spielberg saw the puppet and was basically like, that's way too cute. You can't have that go bad. Like that's your sidekick. It becomes a boy and his dog movie. You need that guy has to stay good with Billy the whole way through. And so they rallied, they figured it out, and all worked, and it worked great. But Joe gives full credit to Spielberg on that. He's like, yeah, he saw it and he was right, and that probably is what turned it from being kind of like here's like the really fun, awesome horror movie that appeals to like this one niche to, even as a 6 or 7 year old, loving it as a kid, because you're like, you know what, like these things are terrifying, but like I get to go on an adventure with like this, like the coolest pet on the planet. They're like, yeah, of course I want to.
Has it got a name, Dad?
Yeah, Mogwai.
What?
Mogwai. I don't know, it's some Chinese word. I just call him Gizmo. He seems to like it.
The Baby Yoda of the 80s.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I should put my headphones in. I still have one of my Gizmo toys in the closet over here from the 80s. Yeah, he was so cute. Everybody wanted him.
Of course.
Yeah.
And, I think that is a brilliant note, and I'm so glad that they adhered to that. And I think that just speaks to Spielberg's storytelling genius and, his power of a knowing the audience and knowing what they would connect with. And I just think it was executed perfectly, and I'm so glad that that stayed to be the case.
Yeah.
So with Bugs in this, voiced awesomely by Eric Bauza, he
so
also
good.
does a rendition of Diabolical Sabotage a little bit, starting with the word sail.
That's what I was going to say. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
He walks up
Sally.
And he goes, "Oh, self-driving cars for Sally."
Yeah, it's such a nice little touch.
It was. In this cartoon, they also talk about, while I'm on that note, automobiles is one of my favorite readings as well.
Yeah.
That just cracked me up. But Bugs, while he's in this luxurious car, is offered chocolate-covered carrots. So, Brendan, have you ever had a chocolate-covered carrot before?
Surprisingly, no. And I'm just thinking, I'm like, my kids, I have 7-year-old twins who love to constantly make their own meals. And considering they love both chocolate and carrots, I'm actually shocked because I've had almond butter covered carrots from them. And there's been a lot of things that carrots have been mixed with. But I'm like, surprisingly, they have yet to do that. So I'll get them on the case. I want to see how it tastes.
Me too. Let me
Yeah.
know.
We'll do it. Yeah, I'll pass it on.
Thank you. They look delicious in the cartoon.
It does.
But
It's
obviously,
amazing.
they're animated.
Sure. Yeah, but it sells it.
It does. It does.
Oh, carrots hard to find. You get a dozen for a dime. It's magic.
And obviously, we have callbacks. We have Bugs holding on for dear life as the gremlin is attacking him with a crowbar while holding on to the front of the car. And then Bugs is like, no, let me do this. And he takes the crowbar and he starts, prying himself off of the car. Yeah. Just the same way as he took the mallet before exploding
blow himself
the bomb.
up.
And then
Yeah.
he's like, whoa, what am I doing? What am I doing?
What am I doing?
It's just the way that this gremlin gets into this character's head. And this character is the most powerful Looney Tune because he is cool, confident, knows how to win.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy just keeps coming at him and he has no way out. And I think that is what's fascinating. And I think obviously that's what fascinated viewers and other creatives because they were like, oh, what can we do with a character that a protagonist is really like definitely up against and they don't know a way around him. And one of the things you guys did was you had an entire fantastical land to go to where the gremlins exist and they're in peace until a bird swoops down and brings the danger into the real world.
Magic is all around us, but you'll never see it if you don't go out and look.
How did that idea come about of the Mogwai being a society and safe from harm all like throughout the land until an invader comes in?
We started taking a pretty big view of what Mogwai could be and how they would interact with the world and trying to come up with something I felt not logical because in a weird way, like the whole fun of Gremlins and Mogwai is not being logical, but it was like what kind of feels like a reason that these creatures would exist and have the rules imposed on them that they do. So one of the first things we did actually as a writer's room, Z, myself, and we had 3 staff writers and an amazing script coordinator. We all brainstormed as many possible questions about Mogwai as we could think of. Like it was, okay, beyond just the why are there the 3 rules, it would also be that like, how do these rules actually work? Like kind of the classic fan type of things of like, oh, when does midnight, if after midnight, when would that end? And also ranging, it was even getting to questions like, all right, do they procreate on their own or only through water? Like things like that. It's like trying to just what's everything we could possibly want to address about them. And it eventually we got to the point of, as we were talking about them, was like, okay, this is I won't go too far into spoilers for the series, but it started to make sense to us that like somebody had to create Mogwai as a test because there is something about Mogwai, and it feels something honestly about the Gremlin in the Bug shorts of it feels like this creature was almost created and put there to drive you insane or to test your metal kind of thing. So we landed on, because that would make sense of the rules, where it was like can you take care of something that's almost impossible to take care of?
Yeah.
And that was kind of our beginning point. So it was like, okay, so then we could get to like let's start from the really cute, adorable place, because it was similar to the film. We were also using the thing of like, if you start on the cutest version, start with the part that makes you just feel warm and snuggly and, oh my God, I want to root for this poor Gizmo kind of, he's saving his people, but ends up in this terrible spot. It's like, your heart's just going to reach out to him. You're going to be right there with Sam of like, I want to take care of this little guy. And as such, you're basically entering into the worst like pet contract possible of like, you're going to take care of something that is theoretically going to ruin all of human civilization.
That's amazing. And I totally agree. Like putting him in that scenario where, I mean, that entire world is adorable. Like, I want to
Yeah,
live there. Like, all
exactly.
those little gremlin or all those little mogwai running around. It's just so fantastic. And yeah, like he gets thrown into a circus kind of situation, and oh, it's awful.
Yeah, that's
But
it. Yeah, and then we just knew it'd also be if you start that cute, people will be on board no matter how. Because then we knew on the other end, like we know the kind of Gremlins gore we want to get to. Like once things
yeah,
start going bad, where it's like if you start cute and give them cute every now and then, it's also earning the like body horror as like kind of limbs are chopped off and Gremlins exploding and stuff like that. It yeah, felt like you could balance it.
and the villain was so like interesting and traumatizing with the way that he dislocates his jaw to like
Yes.
suck souls out of people and
Yeah.
then eat it like orbs. Like, ooh, like
Thank you. Yeah. Credit to, I want to say it was Dan Crawl, who's our supervising producer and kind of really helped kind of define a lot of the visuals for the show. I think he's the one who landed on the giant jaw, like especially at least that a specific visual of the eyes kind of almost rolling back into the head and kind of going glowing. And then we also at some point early on for how to do the animation, somebody's like, oh, well, like, what if we just make it look like it's a practical effect from the 80s with that kind of like almost like the kind of weird frame rate kind of feel and like sound effects of that like clicking and unhinging. So it was like if you were looking at like kind of like how would Poltergeist or how would like Beetlejuice have kind of done that kind of like stretching effect.
Oh, yeah, here I come, baby.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, so that was kind of the logic to it. And it was funny because it was one of those things of like once you did it, it's like, oh yeah, this feels like a nightmare from your childhood.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I couldn't get that visual out of my head for days, so
Oh,
thank you
good.
for that.
It's our goal.
Yes. And you accomplished it beautifully.
Our only concern should be the Mogwai falling into the wrong hands.
Who's that?
The wrong hands.
The scope of this thing is so gigantic. Like, you go from obviously like this community of people to a full-on mystical realm through portals and worlds of gods and everything that encompasses that. Shout out to the storyboard team and like whoever created all of those environments. It is incredible to look at. My favorite comes in episode 3 or 3 or 4. It's whenever they go to the mystical witch who's like harnessing the memories of everyone.
Yeah.
And it's like circling above them and they have no recollection of who they are. And one guy thinks he's still 15 whenever he's like in his 50s.
Yep. Yeah, the tea of forgetting and Mengpo's tea house. Yeah, no, yeah, all credit to so Tara Ruping was our art director and just her and her team did an incredible job. And it was always the cool thing is actually everything we try to source it back to Chinese mythology wherever possible. So it was like even like with the tea of forgetting, it's interesting because that's like not a literal thing from mythology, but it was like based on like lots of little pieces of it or kind of just the choice of like the purple cloud and the colors and like trying to take like, okay, so these might have been like a real tea house at the time, but how do we kind of give it almost a haunted house kind of vibe at the same time? Like it was always just the fun of trying to figure out, I don't know, we had a team that thankfully was way into world building. So it was like every episode, like what's kind of the standalone horror kind of feel. Like we wanted to do like the monster, like kind of a monster along the road type of thing, which became our monster on a train episode. And then we knew we wanted kind of like a more like demonic animal type of monster that they'd encounter. And then it was the kind of isolated, like kind of, the tea house was like, oh, the place you stop at, that's the haunted house kind of vibe. And then the cabin in the woods with like kind of monsters outside was we got to our Jiangxi. Yeah. I mean, I think in our ideal version,
Night of the Living Dead.
Exactly. Yep. And that was our goal was like, okay, so what's our Chinese mythology spin on all these kind of horror tropes, these kind of things you've seen. So it's like, okay, our haunted house will be this, our cabin in the woods vampire or our cabin in the woods zombies would instead be the hopping vampires. So it's like kind of little ways to do it all. And it's funny because I think if we had had more episodes, we would have had probably another 10 episodes like that. Like it was that kind of like, we just kept brainstorming like, oh, I want to do this and I want to do this. There was like, remember, there's some phoenix creature that had like poison feathers that we started trying to base an episode around. One of the writers had a pitch for something called Bloodface, which is like a more original creation, but like just such a bizarre concept that was super fun. but it was a case of we always knew our back half. Eventually, it was getting to the spirit market, and then kind of once you hit that, it's basically just like a ball rolling downhill of like, here's just getting increasingly more dangerous and everything we had to kind of hit from there.
So speaking of things that didn't quite make it in, and you alluded to obviously this element of Gremlins not being in that storybook version.
Oh,
the
yeah.
backstory of Elle in this
Yes.
is a different story than what you were initially had in mind, from what I understand. Can you give the audience a little bit of a tease as to what it might have been and why it was so pushed back upon?
It was, yeah, I mean, it was very reasonably pushed back upon. We had amazing execs. We had amazing support from Amblin and Warner Brothers. In that everything else that we had, whether it was like chopping off limbs, having humans die, all that, it was always yes, go further, that's fine. Except for Z's first draft of Elle, or I'm trying to remember, it was either Z or that episode's writer, Sarah Noboso. I forget who wrote the very first pass. The very first pass was basically a please no, go back. I don't remember the entire thing, or I don't know at least I don't know if I can share the entire thing. But I do know the last part, it got to a point of Elle's parents. I just remember the line of like, and then the rats came. That basically is like, it got to like after all these other horrible things, the final punchline was, and then they were devoured by rats. Like it was like this incredible. So that one was just the like, oh my God, horror. And after that, we ultimately wrote 3 more versions, and it was the still very clearly horrifying and very clearly dead version still made it. But like there was 2 more that were still like somewhere between devoured by rats and just falling to their death. That did also got passed over. And I know, yeah, Sarah definitely wrote some of them also. I forget who wrote the rats one, but I know one of them was them being cooked in a mooncake by accident. They tried to rob something and get trapped and cooked into a mooncake. Wow. And I feel like there may have been another one that was fire based, but yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I was always interested in the other versions that might have been, but definitely in the one that was chosen, it does leave Elle terrified and also very sad because her parents wanted to get away from her, and to do it in that way is just so traumatizing. But it harkens back to Phoebe Cates' origin of her dad dying in the chimney, and I love how that's just a continued mechanism in the story of like one of the characters has to have this really tragic backstory around her parents.
It was again, it was also, I think early on we made a list of like, oh, things we want to do, like kind of an Easter egg of, or like, a callback to in some way. And somebody landed on, because we knew it's like, well, Elle's an orphan, and like the most famous dead parent monologue of all time is in Gremlins. So it was like, if we're gonna go that way, it became kind of the fun competition in the room of who can figure out the way to work it in, and all credit to Sarah.
Amazing job. But again, the writing is impeccable, and we've got to talk about the female gremlin that comes out of this and turns into the big bad at the end. I'm not going to give away how, but it's something that I, as a Gremlins fan, always wanted to see.
Cool.
And I'm so glad that it was brought to fruition in this way, because I feel like animation is one of the only mediums that you can tell this story in. And I think you utilized it very well. So can you talk a bit about the incorporation of this very specific character from Gremlins 2, mind you, like not Gremlins 1, Gremlins 2, and how they personified pure evil and really going after Gizmo in this horrific yet child-friendly way, family-friendly way. And like just how that idea came about. And then I'm going to show you a photo, because the love for this character still grows and is still present, because my wife and I went to Midsummer Scream last weekend, and someone dressed up as this character.
Oh, that's so awesome. So we always knew Claw was going to ultimately become our big bad by the end. Like that was something I think in Z's original pitch, we were working backwards from it. But it was always a little bit early on of how we were going to get there, of exactly how Green would kind of bring about his own downfall, how everything else was going to get there. And two things. One was that Z had the pitch of trying to actually, is like, oh, well, like, let's let the Gremlins have gender, or at least gender identity, and like let's kind of play with that more. Like, it was cool that that's in Gremlins too, and like it just gives you even more distinct ways to play the Gremlins. Because one of the things that I especially as a huge Gremlins fan love, I love the bar scene in the original, and I love in the second movie where they just start running with like more and more singular identity to all of them. Like, they're fun as a big chaotic mass, but like they giving them their own specific personalities and touches just makes them even funnier and more fun to me. So Z had the idea of like, oh, like Claw as kind of like evil, and like her accentuated body part rather than like the hair would be the claws, and just some kind of fun things to play with. So as we kept running with her, we got to two things. One was the visual gag that we play with in that last episode. It's like, well, we've all seen Gremlins attack a city one way. Let's try the complete opposite. Yes. The other thing though was giving her, knowing where it was always going to go. It's like a little bit of tragedy, and maybe almost even a little sympathy for her, of like, if it is she can take a whole city, but the one thing she really wants is Gizmo, and she can't have him. And once that lands on, it's like, on the one hand, it's like, oh, and like a normal movie, you can see that as like, oh, it's the tragic flaw of the villain. And here, though, one of the great things with Gremlins that we realized early on is like, take something very serious and genuine, and once you put it through them, it becomes hilarious, because it's just like, they are ridiculous, but they're not characters who need to always, be winking or playing, although they can break the fourth wall and do that too. But like, treating them with like utter sincerity and seriousness comes off ridiculous. Like for Claw, it's like going into Claw's mind and seeing like what her versions of fantasies are is like totally sincere to her emotion, but also totally ridiculous to us, because it is like her and Gizmo, spoiler for where it all goes, her and Gizmo having a wedding or things like that, that it's just like her sincere emotions. You just don't expect it in that creature in that way. So it just became something that started cracking us up, and thankfully worked well as like, oh, like, yeah, this is kind of helps give a little bit of like, what's the one thing too far she does that's going to cost her here?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful trait, and one that's not really delved too deep in within villains, having them fantasize about something they can't have, and then that being the thing that undoes them. And you guys did that really well. And I also wanted to give a shout out to whoever animated the three Gremlins, like the Three Stooges, whenever they're in the prison and they're just like pulling antics on each other.
God, so much fun. Yeah, our storyboard artists are so good with that. Yeah, and they were the ones, our board artists ended up creating my favorite of the Three Stooges there, the liquid gremlin in the jar. Because early on, originally, it was just a case of he vomited it up, it got cleaned away, that was it. They had the fun idea of like, no, it's still alive, blinking. And then it was like, let's keep it in a jar. And then it was, so, because we named that model based on its look, that was Gap Tooth. And then once he became the liquid version, it's like, oh, well, now he's Goop Tooth. So it became then Goop Tooth living on. It was just always us thinking of like more ways, like, let's keep Goop Tooth around, which is how he got his cameo late in the season in the 9th episode, where it's like, no, we can't get rid of Goop Tooth. He's too amazing.
There's a lot more amazingness to explore within this series. I highly recommend watching it. Go watch every episode of it. Here's the photo.
Oh my God, that's awesome.
Yeah, this is from Midsummer Scream.
Fantastic, Greta.
I'll be posting that on my blog as well as the Instagram when this goes live. Brendan, I have one other question for you.
Please.
And that is, will we ever learn how Sam Wing lost his left eye?
Yes, if we get a season 3, I will let you, because we've already made season 2. Yes, so season 2 is coming sometime in 2024. We don't know more than that yet, but it is made. It will be coming. And we actually just finished post on it very recently, so it's looking great. It's awesome.
Amazing.
And I will, though, just to keep expectations in mind, Z and I know how Sam loses the eye and what happens to him.
Okay.
It is not in season 2. It is a story that we didn't get to in season. It was in a very early pitch of season 2 that had way too much stuff for one season. That was an element in there. So as we were like, okay, we can't do every possible thing we want to. That came out, but we do have a story behind it. We know the answer to it.
Amazing. Thank you for that tease.
Yeah.
So, Brendan, hey, this has been amazing. Where can people find you online?
Sure. So I am still on Twitter, which I know it has a new name now, but it's Twitter. At
Still Twitter as long as we're concerned.
exactly at B_Hay Hay. I'm also on Instagram at Brendan Hay Writer, and I'm also on Blue Sky at the one I always forget now. I think it's just B Hay and then whatever they are, B Sky. They have a far too. It's a great service that has a far too long handle to remember. I apologize, but yeah. But basically, I'm usually, if you look either Brendan Hay Writer or B Hay on any of the social medias, you'll find me.
Amazing. And you can follow the podcast over at Instagram at This Means Podcast, or still on Twitter at OFC This Means Pod. And we also have a Patreon if you want to go support the podcast. We would love it. And just keep the conversation going, whether it's Looney Tunes, Gremlins, Tiny Toons, whatever you like within the Looniverse. Keep it going because, as always, that's not all, folks. Keep it loony.
Sorry, folks. We ran out of gas. Yeah, you know how it is with these A-cards.